Bruce Hoffman is a professor at the Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service, where he directs the Center for Jewish Civilization and teaches in the Security Studies Master's Degree of Arts program. I had the honor of serving with him. He was just down the hall from me when I was in the same building when I was teaching at Georgetown before I came to the Bush School. So we became friends then. Dr. Hoffman is also the Shelby Cullum and Catherine Davis Visiting Fellow for Counterterrorism and Homeland Security at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is the George Gilmore Senior Fellow at the U.S. Military's Academy of Combating Terrorism Center. He is the author of the award-winning book Anonymous Soldier in 2015. His most recent books included Inside Terrorism. By the way, it is the textbook on terrorism used at universities and in our military academies and in the CIA, I presume too, Bruce, in the United States. It is the cited textbook. And I think it's not an exaggeration. I'm not saying because he's here, but he is the leading expert in terrorism probably in the world, let alone in the United States. And so it's an honor to have him here. His book, Inside Terror, the textbook, is cited as one of the 25 most notable books published by Columbia University Press at its 125th anniversary. He wrote a book in 2014, The Evolution of the Global Terrorist Threat, and he's co-authored of a book provisionally titled Blood, Patriots, and Tyranny, A History of Far Right-Wing Terrorism, which will be published in 2024. He holds degrees in government history and international relations and received his PhD from Oxford. Tonight, we're going to have Mike Howell, Professor Mike Howell, who's an associate professor of the practice at the Bush School. He's a retired FBI agent, senior FBI agent. Professor Howell investigated domestic and international complex crimes and terrorism, as well as led and supervised training for FBI agents and support and executive personnel in the FBI. By the way, he's very popular among the students and very respected among the faculty, I might add. Mike's international experience includes assignments as assistant and acting legal attaché at U.S. embassies, where he routinely provided expert advice in law enforcement and terrorism matters for U.S. ambassadors and host nations around the world. So it's my pleasure first to introduce Bruce Hoffman to talk, and then Mike Howell will come up, join him, and I'm going to sit here and relax. And then as Bruce finishes, you can pass your cards down. Mike will take them and then read through them. Bruce, please join us. Thank you.
Thank you for that extremely kind introduction, Andrew. And thank you very much for inviting me back to College Station. I've actually been back since you invited me some years ago. I think I've worked in several presidential archives, and the Bush Library and Archives here is like one of the best and the best organized. Unfortunately, that book has not gone forward because I put in 14,000 what's called MDR, mandatory declassification requests, FOIAs basically. And over the past 6 years, this is mostly from the Reagan Library actually, I've only gotten 39 documents. So that project unfortunately is sort of foundered. And then I turned my attention to domestic terrorism. What I'm going to talk to you tonight is about the international terrorist threat. And my plan, and I hope, and that's why I decided not to read a paper, because every professor who reads a paper ends up going on much longer than they ever promise. I think it's much easier when you've got a PowerPoint, at least if I'm boring you, you have lots of pictures to look at, but there's less prose for me to focus on. So I'll focus on the international terrorist threat today, at least as I see it. Now, it's not entirely clear that Leon Trotsky actually said this, and in fact, it reappeared in a novel a few years ago, but it's a great quote. Actually, you know, sometimes like if you've seen Who Shot Liberty Valance with John Wayne and Jimmy Stewart, the famous line there is, if the legend collides with the truth, print the legend. But I think this is a great quote nonetheless. Let's hope that it was him. You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And if you just substitute terrorism from war, you'll see where I'm coming from. And in fact, I'm very much in the school of, I believe, definitely a former dean, I think a former president of Texas A&M, Robert Gates, Okay, so Robert Gates, when he was DCI, back in those days, there wasn't a director of wasn't a director of the Central Intelligence Agency, it was the director of Central Intelligence everywhere. He famously said, and I've been a terrorism analyst now for 42 years, and I completely agree with former Secretary Gates when he said that the problem with intelligence analysts is whenever they smell flowers, they immediately think funeral. So that's almost 50 years of studying terrorism have put me and you'll see from this very depressing briefing, unfortunately. Now, I will be remiss also in not saying something about the war in Iraq, whose 20th anniversary we just marked a few weeks ago. And of course, there's all sorts of reasons, and you will have read the commentary. I actually served with the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq in 2004, and then I was back on U.S. government business in 2006 and 2008, have my own views. One of the better books on the conflict was written by New York Times correspondent Robert Draper, whether you agree with him or not that it was a colossal failure and mistake. I mean, nonetheless, the death toll that accrued from Iraq has been absolutely astonishing. Nearly 500,000 Iraqis and 8,500 of both U.S. personnel and contractors there. But the reason I'm putting this up is not because of my own experiences, or not even necessarily because March 20th marked the 20th anniversary. But if you've been studying terrorism as long as I have, and I was really started it a long time ago, in 1976 when I first went to graduate school, so, which is a long time. I'm not sure I've learned all that much, but you can be the judge of that. But the point is that, and if you have a good memory, I remember very clearly that combined with Operation Iraqi Freedom, the invasion and toppling of Saddam Hussein and subsequent occupation of Iraq, was also trumpeted as having dealt a significant blow to international terrorism. And sort of the triumphalist drumbeat that got combined with that began even before the invasion. And I will be completely honest about my powers of analysis and prescience. Like, I don't know, many people, like few people. Even in March 1st, 2003, I still thought there would be some way that we weren't, in fact, going to war. But on March 1st, we captured Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the mastermind behind the September 11th, 2001 attacks. And from that time forward, both Al-Qaeda and the war on terror got wrapped up with Iraq. And basically, part of the selling of Iraq was that this would deal a signal blow to our enemies in the war on terror. And you can see this just 4 days before the invasion, citing senior administration sources at the time. The front page of the Washington Post had a headline that said, "Al-Qaeda top primed to collapse." So in other words, you saw this confluence. It only really continued. We had then Representative Porter Goss, who only a few months later became Director of Central Intelligence, discussing how the tide had turned against them. Another senior terrorism expert claiming, again, 4 days before the invasion, we've nailed them. And then even in the weeks following the invasion, after Al-Qaeda had failed to deliver on its many threats and promises to turn Iraq into hell for the U.S. invading force. I mean, they subsequently succeeded in doing so, but at the time they hadn't. Other positive claims that really a corner had been turned on the war on terror. Well, you know, sometimes things don't go exactly as one plans, and amidst a lot of the success that was unfolding then, one thought against the war on terror, there were several significant terrorist incidents that challenged that assumption. Because, again, I remember this very clearly, we were fighting them over there so we don't have to fight them here. Fortunately, they never came back to the United States, really until the killings at Pensacola Naval Air Station just before Christmas 4 years ago. That has been certainly an unqualified success. But we did see that Al-Qaeda, at a time that the center, that the Al-Qaeda core senior leadership was shrinking, Al-Qaeda was also expanding elsewhere. And there were very significant attacks in Jakarta and Istanbul, and of course from roughly June 2003, but really August and September 2003, the insurgency precipitously escalated in Iraq, in large measure because of someone named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was affiliated with al-Qaeda and then subsequently changed the name of his terrorist group to align it very closely with al-Qaeda in 2004 to al-Qaeda in Iraq. Even so, the former head of the Counterterrorism Center at the CIA, who was then the State Department's coordinator for counterterrorism, Cofer Black, in January 24th, also talked about an end to the terrorist threat that had been achieved. And only 6 weeks later came the enormous tragedy, Spain's own equivalent of 9/11, which they call their 3/11, the simultaneous bombings of 4 commuter trains as they pulled into the Atocha rail station in Madrid, where 200 persons were killed, and then the following year, the simultaneous attacks on London Transport on 3 subway trains, and then on a bus that killed 52 and wounded 800 others. But nonetheless, the continued narrative of progress against al-Qaeda continued. And in fact, as politics often gets mixed with many other things, terrorism is no exception. Every single president since the war on terror commenced over 2 decades ago has declared victory or some form of victory against our adversaries. President George W. Bush, President Obama, President Trump, President Biden, all have basically said that this threat was being put in the rear view mirror. Now, I have been to Iraq multiple times, again, U.S. government service. I've been to Afghanistan as well. I'm not at all dismissive. I've seen on the ground how enormously challenging and difficult it is in these types of environments to achieve any kind of access. Anyone who's worked in government knows that to move bureaucracy, especially the U.S. government's bureaucracy, is enormously difficult. So I'm not in the least diminishing the progress that we have made in the war on terror, especially in keeping the homeland safe. But my point is that too often the American public has been told that this is a threat that we no longer have to worry about. And you'll see why I think this is so important. Heads of our intelligence agencies have said very similar things. This is just one example from Matt Olson, who's now in the Department of Justice and is the Assistant Attorney General for National Security. And then even secretaries of state. And this one I want to just pause and dwell on for a moment. 3/6/2020, it means it was right before COVID hit. In fact, until this January, that was the last time I had been outside of the country. That week I was in Marrakesh, Morocco, not on holiday. In fact, we rarely get to take holidays. It was an international conference co-sponsored by the U.S. Department of State, the Foreign Ministry of Poland, and the Foreign Ministry of Kenya. The title of it was The Continuing Threat from Al-Qaeda. Over 60 countries sent representatives. In fact, I was one of the few civilians there who was not from a Justice or Homeland Security or a Ministry of Foreign Affairs or a State Department. And this is not to be disrespectful or to be snarky about Mike Pompeo. It's just to emphasize sometimes the divide between policy and reality, or politics and counterterrorism. So that day, it was, in fact, I can tell you, it was a Thursday. In March 2020, he said Al-Qaeda was a shadow of its former self. That was the last day of the conference, where 66 countries issued a proclamation. The purpose of the conference was to discuss how Al-Qaeda, even though it had been relatively quiescent, had been hanging back, letting ISIS, or the Islamic State, preoccupy our attention, absorb all our energies, while Al-Qaeda was quietly rebuilding to become a threat. So you have State Department saying one thing, members of the State Department signing this joint statement of 66 countries saying that we still have to pay attention to Al-Qaeda, even though that we've been focused, of course, for the past several years, 2020, on ISIS. And we've said the same things about ISIS to an extent as well, mostly during the period that the caliphate was defeated and eliminated. But that's part of the problem, is that physically defeating the caliphate or physically defeating ISIS's military capabilities on the ground is very different from countering its ideology, which is one of the themes actually of this presentation. And of course, why I was so thrilled to accept Professor Natsios' very kind invitation to come to Texas A&M and to the Bush School to speak to you, In all honesty, I mean, the intelligence community and Department of Defense occasionally still invite me to talk about terrorism, but there's just no interest in terrorism anymore. I mean, rightly so. Russia's invaded Ukraine, China's saber-rattling with Taiwan, Iran's march towards building a nuclear weapon and the potential that Israel might launch a preemptive strike. We do have far more, I wouldn't say far more important, but we still have far more vexing and immediate national security challenges today than we did for most of the war on terror, when we had the luxury of focusing on one enemy that was just in a handful of places. So now, amidst all of that, we have a new national defense strategy, not inappropriately, but terrorism is no longer the preeminent national security issue that it was for roughly 17 or 18 years of the war on terror. And then we have a quote from Al-Qaeda's chief spokesperson back in May 2003. Again, this is the problem with being with studying terrorism for so long, is that you remember all these things. And he had said, the Americans only have, this was in the context of the invasion of Iraq, of course, and some of those comments, well, Al-Qaeda didn't do anything, so the threat must be over. And Thabit bin Qais said, the Americans only have predictions and old intelligence left. It will take them a long time to understand the new form of Al-Qaeda. And that made me think about two quotes from two of the world's greatest strategists, at least in my view, or at least amongst them, saying similar things, basically about the same place, but almost a century apart. Because Winston Churchill, one of his books, The Malakand Field Force, is precisely about a British Army incursion into what's today Afghanistan to fight against the Pashtuns, who of course are what is today the Taliban. And then General Mattis, when he was, before he was Secretary of Defense, when he was the Commander-in-Chief of the Central Command. And I think this is a very important way to look at things, is that as they both say the same thing, as the enemy gets a vote or the enemy has a say. So that's how I've attempted to frame this presentation, where we'll look first from the US viewpoint. And there, I think the main question one asks, 20 plus years on from the September 11th attacks, are we safer today than we were then? And then let's take a look from the terrorist point of view, and from bin Laden's perspective. If he were still living, what would he think of what's going on today? So first, are we safer today? Indisputably, the homeland is safer. Of that, there's no doubt. I mean, there's a sea change in our domestic preparedness, especially against international terrorism. The Department of Homeland Security did not exist on September 10th, 2001. The National Counterterrorism didn't exist. The Terrorist Screening Center didn't exist. In fact, according to a landmark study done by the Washington Post by Dana Priest and William Arkin some years ago, they counted over 250 US government agencies that at the height of the war on terror had at least some aspect of the counterterrorism mission. Again, I'm old enough to remember prior to 9/11, terrorism was a law enforcement problem. Not a military one, and not necessarily even an intelligence one. It was law enforcement. So that underscores the change. U.S. intelligence community's budget, largely as a result of the war on terrorism, has also grown exponentially, and it's more than double the 2001 figure. And then you can see, on 9/11, the FBI had fewer than 5,000 people on its no-fly list. Today, there's over 1 million. So these are all huge changes that have indeed kept us safer. Also, just looking at the past 3 or 4 years alone, the United States has been remarkably successful and remarkably effective at eliminating al-Qaeda senior leadership. I mean, this is what the Israelis sometimes call mowing the grass. I mean, we've mowed it down, that there's, almost, you can see the turf in essence. I mean, it starts with and this is just a very selective list from 4 years ago. If you go back longer, of course, there's many other people to add, Osama bin Laden himself. But Hamza bin Laden, his son and heir apparent from 2019, many of the most prominent local commanders of al-Qaeda have been eliminated by ourselves and by our allies. And of course, just this past summer, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the co-founder of al-Qaeda in 1988, and bin Laden's successor, was also eliminated. In addition, as I said a few minutes ago, we dismantled the caliphate. I mean, when one thinks about that, the Islamic State was shockingly large. At one point, ISIS ruled over, I think it was 282,000 square miles, basically territory equivalent to England, Wales, and Scotland, and held sway over some 7 million people. So enormously successful, but it was dismantled by an 81-nation coalition. Took, after all, 4 or 5 years. But subsequently, we also were remarkably successful in very short order of eliminating ISIS's founder and leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and then a bit less than 2 years later, eliminating his successor. So that now the current leader or the current emir of ISIS, very little is known about him. He keeps a very low profile because he knows that he's got a target on his back. And in fact, just last month, we killed 2 very senior ISIS commanders in Syria. So we've clearly made inroads against the leadership of these groups. But then, at least for my money nowadays, in terms of open source information, ironically, the United Nations, I think, is one of the most effective sources. I mean, for me, I say ironically because for most of my career, the United States was pretty much always complaining about the United Nations not taking the threat of terrorism seriously enough. And usually we were the ones that were positing dire warnings or proclaiming new threats. But this is from the most recent report, the 31st report, so they've been doing this for a long time, of the Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team, which basically focuses on the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS and its various affiliates. And I won't read this, you can just quickly scan it, but what you can see is that they paint a picture of groups that we may say have been defeated, we may say are shadows of their former selves, but their raison d'etre, their entire inner logic is to constantly regroup and reorganize, replenish their forces, and carry on a struggle that they see is divinely ordained. And that is commanded by theology, that's communicated by clerics, and therefore it's not up to mere mortal man to lay down their arms. And this is part of the reason for the persistence and perniciousness of their ideology. And Christine Abizaid, actually the daughter of General Abizaid, who was the commander of Central Command at the height of the Iraqi insurgency, is now the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. And in an interview she gave just 3 months ago, I mean, she also made this point about threats that have to constantly have pressure applied to them, otherwise they will resurface. Again, when it comes to terrorism and just everything going on in the world, not least COVID, we have very short memories. But Easter Sunday, so just about 4 years ago next week, right, this coming Sunday, in fact, unmitigated tragedy occurred in Sri Lanka. Again, to show you my powers of analysis and prescience, I've been to Sri Lanka many times actually studying the Tamil Tigers, the liberation tigers of Tamil Eelam, had met on those many occasions with the Muslim community there. It's a very small community, only about 5% of the population. Even in my first trip to Sri Lanka in 1997, the elders in the Muslim community were very concerned about radicalization, but it was mostly dismissed and ignored. I was completely stunned. Firstly, that ISIS, after the enormous pressure they were under during that 81-nation coalition's assault on their caliphate, nonetheless, 2 groups emerged completely from obscurity that no one had ever heard of before. In fact, one of them, the National Tawhid Jamaat, its previous quote-unquote terrorist acts had been basically defacing Buddhist statues with hammers. Muslim group, Buddhism is the predominant religion of the Sinhalese, who make up about 65% or so of the population. So there's a huge, huge leap from jumping off of the back of a motorcycle and picking up a hammer and defacing a Buddhist statue to carrying out 5 out of 6 simultaneous suicide attacks against various targets, churches, hotels, restaurants, and so on. So at a time when we really believed ISIS was on its back foot and defeated, it emerged in a place no one ever imagined. I mean, Sri Lanka has had for decades now, certainly since 1983, but you can trace it back further. Really horrific civil war and bloodletting. I mean, there's plenty of domestic terrorism in Sri Lanka, but international terrorism. And then no one knew that there was an ISIS connection there. But as Sun Ce, the famous Chinese strategist of centuries ago, famously said that the way soldiers are like water and flow wherever they're unimpeded, same thing with terrorists. Wherever they can strike and believe they can be successful, they will do so. What was so alarming about this attack is that, I would argue, I'm not an ordnance specialist, but improvised explosive devices, generally speaking, are more art than science. Lots of people end up blowing themselves up, in fact. Triacetone triperoxide, TATP, is an enormously unstable and difficult homemade explosive device. It's one of the most active elements in it is cigarette lighter fuel. So you basically have to know what you're doing. And in fact, that's why only 5 of 6 explosions happened. There was a 6th bomber. His explosive device failed to explode at the Taj Samudra Hotel, where I used to always stay when I went to Sri Lanka. So it's stuck in my mind. And this was the other thing, is that his bomb failed. He could have easily just thrown it in the wastebasket, gone home and said, okay, it wasn't my time. Fate intervened in that it was decreed that I would not die today. He was so determined, so implacably determined to follow in the footsteps of his fellow bombers, is that he went back to his rooming house and then disassembled the bomb and was trying to rearm it when he accidentally blew himself up. That's why I said this is more art than science, even if you know what you're doing. What I find is even scarier about this is not only were these individuals radicalized from a community that no one was really paying much attention to, that was seen as a backwater, their families went completely over to the other side. The wives of 2 of the ringleaders actually blew themselves and their children and relatives up when the Sri Lankan police came to raid the houses that they were living in once the identification of the bombers were made. In fact, there were 2 brothers involved. We often think of terrorists as being uneducated, poor, no other prospects in life, easily kind of suborned or convinced to carry out terrorist operations. 2 of the 6 bombers were the sons of the wealthiest man, one of the wealthiest men, I should say, in Sri Lanka. And somehow this virus infected their families as well. I mean, you just have to think, any of you who are parents, I mean, our most natural inclination is to protect and to succor and to give sanctuary to our children, not to blow them up when the police come knocking at the door. But this is the power of ISIS's, and I would argue, unfortunately as well, Al-Qaeda's ideology. They share the same ideology. There's absolutely no difference. I mean, the difference, I would say, is in style and tone. I have this on another slide, I'm kind of jumping ahead, but Al-Qaeda's in it for the long game. I would say Al-Qaeda is kind of like La Cosa Nostra or organized crime, right? They do what they need to be done, but they're very cautious. They're going to keep their violence within certain boundaries, so that doesn't completely eliminate the organization. We already know ISIS was coloring way outside the lines, created the caliphate, and that's why there was an 81-nation coalition against them. I've actually testified in a trial against 2 of the so-called Beatles, the 2 British citizens who joined ISIS. One of them took a plea deal. The other one went to trial. And I've testified in trials before. Usually I fly in somewhere, give my testimony, and then I have to be back to teach or go home to my family. This one was actually in suburban Washington, D.C., so I sat through the 3.5 weeks of it. And my conclusion from watching the defendant and from the testimony of the European hostages who was freed and the testimony of the families, how individuals like James Foley, Stephen Satloff, Peter Kassig, Kyla Mueller, the American hostages who were cruelly murdered. You know, so if Al-Qaeda is like the Mafia or La Cosa Nostra, in my view, ISIS is like the Manson family. They are just homicidal killers. And in many cases, I mean, absolutely, both of them. Even Alexander Cote, who took the plea deal and wrote a 25-page handwritten single-spaced document to the judge, basically attempting to be assigned to a prison elsewhere than the Supermax in Florence, Colorado. You read, and you can find that document in Washington Post or the New York Times. Absolutely no remorse. I mean, completely self-serving. And of course, as the judge rightly said, he doesn't determine, Bureau of Prisons determines where people go to serve out their sentences, not him, and kind of dismissed it because it was really extremely cynical, but I'm unfortunately diverting. Also, even though we don't hear much about ISIS outside of Syria and a little bit in Iraq, I mean, they are expanding in Africa. Amazingly, they're supposedly defeated. They have expanded from North Africa to Central Africa and even to Southern Africa. They were able, much like they did in Sri Lanka, to co-opt or suborn or somehow persuade a local group to hitch their fortunes to what we see as a falling star. But some of these local terrorist groups still see enormous benefit in allying with ISIS. They very quickly shot up almost threefold to 3,000 to 3,500 fighters. For a time, took over Cabo Delgado, a major oil producing center. In fact, someone I met the last time I was in Houston who has some oil interests there was emailing me throughout that entire time, trying to learn more about ISIS. Of course, you know, it's the civilians, it's the innocent people who always suffer from terrorism. 4,000 civilians killed. If you recall from the newspaper headlines from just a few years ago, at least 50 Mozambican soldiers and oil workers lined up in the city town square of Cabo Delgado, where, of course, they were beheaded because that's ISIS's thing. And this led one analyst to say, a security analyst of Southern Africa, to say, you know, we used to look at Ansar al-Sun as just a bunch of gangsters or bandits. Now they're well-trained fighters, and it basically took the special forces, special operations forces from South Africa and Rwandan troops to turn the tide there. So General McKenzie, like General Mattis, another Marine who was the immediate previous commander of U.S. Central Command, a few years ago said, and you know, someone like General McKenzie speaks, I listen, the conditions are as bad or worse than those that spawned the original rise of ISIS, which I think underscores that the war on terror, the bottom line is that this is an ongoing struggle without any deadlines, much as we may wish to declare victory. So the threat from ISIS clearly hasn't gone away. And the problem is the threat from al-Qaeda, I think, is here to stay. Think about it. I said this earlier in the presentation. Al-Qaeda was founded in 1988. You don't get to survive decades unless you have this enormous ability to adjust and adapt to overcome even the most formidable, even the most consequential countermeasures directed against you. Undeniably, they've been successful, but we've held a threat in abeyance that, unfortunately, I would argue, hasn't gone away. And that's why, for the latter part, let's look at it from bin Laden's point of view. If bin Laden was alive today, what would he think? And I hate to say this, and it's very counterintuitive, but I think he'd be thrilled. He'd be absolutely happy because the enterprise that he began 3 or 4 decades ago may not be thriving, but it survived. And think about it. It survived the greatest onslaught, not just by the global coalition that joined to wage the war on terror, but from the most technologically advanced military in the history of mankind. And that, for them, feeds into their narrative and convinces them that having survived, and I'll come to Afghanistan in a second, that my point about being divinely ordained, if they keep struggling, eventually they'll win. This is the famous comment that a Taliban commander said over, well, not quite a decade and a half ago, but pretty close to that. You may have the watches, but we have the time. So from looking at the landscape of the Salafi jihadi ideology, that's a very small percent of the 1.2 billion Muslims throughout the world. It's a minuscule percent of them. But nonetheless, as we saw on September 11th, 2001, all it takes is 19 persons to change the course of history. And that is, of course, always historically been the conceit of terrorists throughout the world, that through their acts of violence, even though they have only limited power, their acts of violence will be so daring, so dramatic, so heinous, that they will somehow have an impact on their enemies, as unfortunately I think al-Qaeda certainly did on September 11th. So looking at the numbers, for example, no matter which source you look at, this ideology has not only resisted 20 years of efforts to defeat the groups that promulgate it, but in fact they're thriving. 2018, the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change in London, using their own metrics, said that there were now 121 violent Islamists. When you see Islamist, it means basically Salafi jihadi. I mean, even Salafists aren't necessarily violent. But these are the people who are perverting or twisting scripture to justify their violence and attract new recruits. 121 groups throughout the world. 2 months later, in November 2018, the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. issued its own report using its own metrics. So they came up with only 67 groups. But nonetheless, that's pretty astonishing. 2018, those 67 groups were a 180% increase over the September 11th, 2001 figure. Looking at State Department country reports, in 2018, the last year that you could really make sense, where they provided these kinds of numbers, 72,000 jihadi fighters around the world compared to about 2,200 on 9/11. It's even simpler. If you go the foreign terrorist organization designation list that the State Department has maintained since 1997, 5 times as many Salafi jihadi groups are designated foreign terrorist organizations today than there were on 9/11. These are the affiliates and the franchises of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So whether it's Al-Shabaab in East Africa, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, in North Africa, JNIM in Central Africa, the Sahel, the Taliban in Afghanistan, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they're all benefiting from our declarations of victory and from withdrawals or drawdowns of U.S. military forces that were forward deployed in many of the hotspots. Admittedly, yes, there were once 700 U.S. special operations and intelligence assets in Somalia fighting against Al-Shabaab. At the end of President Trump's administration, almost all of them were redeployed elsewhere. President Biden has increased that to roughly 400, maybe 500, but it's still not at the number it once was. Now we get to Afghanistan, and as much as it pains me to say this, but at least from Al-Qaeda's perspective, they've won. And in their propaganda, they say that they've won. They triumphed over the West and the United States in particular in this test of wills. ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force, was disbanded and left. In 2014, the United States followed suit. We don't have to resurrect everything that attended the shambolic U.S. withdrawal, but the point I want to make is that Al-Qaeda basically got everything that they wanted. Taliban is back in power. Their safe haven and sanctuary is once again resurrected. In my view, actually, this may be Al-Qaeda's Achilles heel, that they have this inexplicable attachment to Afghanistan. I mean, Khorasan, the Black Flags, that's historically supposedly where this movement was supposed to emerge from. That's why they all have black flags. But they have this romantic attachment to a landlocked country that I think is their weakness. But nonetheless, this was one of their number one priorities, was to defeat the United States and its allies in Afghanistan. You know, right now, I think the Taliban is restraining these groups for the moment. I don't think that's going to last forever. Al-Qaeda's closest allies control the key ministries in Afghanistan. The Haqqani Network, one of the world's most infamous terrorist organizations, I would say close to ISIS in terms of being like Manson types. Sirajuddin Haqqani is the Minister of the Interior, controls the police, the borders, and internal security. His uncle, Khalil Haqqani, is the Minister of Refugees. Siraj Haqqani has a $10 million bounty on his head by the U.S. State Department. His uncle, Khalil, has a $5 million bounty. These are not nice people. Their cousin, Yahya Haqqani, since 2009 has been the liaison between Al-Qaeda and the Haqqani Network and works very closely with his cousins and with his uncle. And then, 2,000 terrorists at least were freed by the Taliban from the Polkichari prison and the prison at Bagram. Amongst them were roughly 36 Al-Qaeda senior leaders. These guys have not, once they're out of prison, become accountants or decided to become pomegranate farmers. You can be sure that they are lending their expertise to Al-Qaeda. And at least for me, it all sounds like the 1990s, when we also believed and trusted the Taliban back then that they would restrain Al-Qaeda. In fact, one reason they won't restrain Al-Qaeda is they owe an enormous debt to Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda's Central Asian allies in particular, from the so-called STANs, the Islamic Jihad Union, the East Turkmenistan Islamic Movement, Jundallah Ansar, and Khatib Iman al-Bukhari, all were force multipliers that strengthened the Taliban and enabled the lightning victory, the blitzkrieg, that occurred during the spring and summer of 2021. And right now, through al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, there's a very salient al-Qaeda presence in at least 8 provinces in Afghanistan right now, where these groups have senior administrative positions, and where in many cases they've been integrated into existing Ministry of the Interior Security Forces or Ministry of Defense units in the Taliban. So for all intents and purposes, just like in the 1990s, there's no real separation between al-Qaeda and the Taliban. As I said, for the moment, to try to get foreign aid, to try to get recognition, the Taliban is restraining them. But already, even with that restraint, we see al-Qaeda kind of, chomping at the bit to re-engage in international terrorism. In July 2021, almost a dozen al-Qaeda operatives were arrested in Lucknow, India, planning massive simultaneous suicide attacks to occur the following January on India's Independence Day. In other words, to once again reinstigate incidents such as the attack on the Indian Parliament in December 2001, or the simultaneous attacks on a variety of targets in Mumbai, India, in November 2008, in hopes of driving India and Pakistan not just to the brink of war, but to engineering a conflict and perhaps even a nuclear exchange. And for my money, such as it is, this is my biggest fear in the last bullet, is that the Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban, who are cheek to jowl with one another, who share the same aim and the same aspiration of dissolving the Durand Line and uniting the Pashtuns on both sides of the Pakistan and Afghan border into a Pashtunistan, in league with al-Qaeda, will attempt to acquire or steal, if not a nuclear weapon, then fissile material from Pakistan's stockpiles. Think back, as close as at one time the U.S. relationship was with Pakistan, especially under President Musharraf in the early years of the war on terror. The United States and no one else was ever given any access to the storage facilities where Pakistan keeps its nuclear weapons. We had to take it at the Pakistanis' word. They also told us bin Laden wasn't hiding there. Also, we know for a fact that the Pakistanis on any given day are moving their nuclear weapons to avoid U.S. and Indian spy satellites. And of course, any precious cargo is much more vulnerable when it's in transit than when it's stationary. So it was the only map I could really find that showed really the dimensions, and this is from 2018. If anything, I would argue it's only, as you'll see in the next slide, strengthened or entrenched itself. But you could see from North Africa to South Africa, West Africa to East Africa, from the Caucasus down through the Middle East, South Asia to Southeast Asia. Either al-Qaeda or ISIS or both of them have a presence. You can see from this next slide from my friend and colleague Katie Zimmerman at the American Enterprise Institute. If you look at those arrows, there's only one arrow in one place that's going down, and that's ISIS in the Sinai Peninsula. In every other place, either group is either strengthening themselves or at least holding steady. And for terrorist groups, holding steady is victory. Conservatively, it's been hard. The State Department country reports amass the number of terrorists, but when I've tried to put them together from open sources, you easily come up with 20,000 men at arms in al-Qaeda nowadays. And again, I'd say this is a conservative estimate. And at least 12,000 conservatively in ISIS. And you can see where they're spread. 25% increase over the past year of ISIS attacks in Iraq, 140% increase in Afghanistan over the past year. And unfortunately, that's kind of been bled a bit, but according to the United Nations, ISIS still has at least $300 million in its treasury. What's blotted out is the $100 million that the U.S. Department of the Treasury estimates. Considering, there's a very famous headline in Newsweek in 2009 about Iraq. How do you defeat foes that build bombs for the price of a pizza? That's a lot of money to use. I'm already going against my promise and talking too much, so I really will move to wrap up. One of my other biggest concerns is the increased focus on commercial aviation. We had a remarkably successful 11-year run in thwarting international terrorist plots against commercial aviation that came to an end in October 2015, when one of ISIS's affiliates was the ISIS franchise in the Sinai Peninsula smuggled a bomb in a Schweppes pineapple soda can onto a Russian Metrojet, a charter flight departing Sharm el-Sheikh in the Sinai, killed 224 persons on board. That following summer, there was a plot to also stage an in-flight bombing against an Etihad Airways flight en route from Sydney, Australia to the Gulf. Basically, the ISIS operatives in Australia could not themselves acquire the off-the-shelf commercial materials to make the bomb. So their commander in Turkey, who was in fact their older brother, this is why it's called the IKEA model, sent them a series of packages through the ordinary mails, through DHS, through FedEx, through other international air integrators, and basically they put together the bomb. When the bomb plot failed against the airliner, they didn't give up. Again, this implacably determined adversaries. They came up with a plot to use a poison gas, the famous Mubtakar that Al-Qaeda was supposed to have used on the New York City subway in February 2002, and then the attack was averted at the last minute. For reasons at least that publicly aren't known, they were planning a similar attack against commuter trains in Australia. Al-Qaeda got into the business too. If ISIS is doing it, Al-Qaeda is going to follow suit. And just a few months later, in Mogadishu, Al-Qaeda smuggled a bomb concealed within a laptop onto a Daallo Airlines flight en route from Mogadishu to Djibouti. It exploded before the plane gained cruising altitude, so basically the bomber blew up himself and knocked a hole in the side of the plane. The pilot was able to safely land. But that was, to me, enormously disturbing. I would put Al-Shabaab, who was responsible for it, as the technologically least adept of Al-Qaeda's franchises, and even they're getting an in-flight bombing business. And then twice within the past 4 years, members of Al-Shabaab, again, I'd say these guys are great with AK-47s or rocket-propelled grenades. In the Philippines and in an African country, you have 2 members of Al-Shabaab arrested, undergoing the exact same training that the 4 pilots did in the United States before the 9/11 attacks. So one way or the other, Al-Qaeda and ISIS are returning to commercial aviation. I think they'll be facilitated by the supposed new leader of Al-Qaeda, Saif al-Adil. He's kind of the Forrest Gump of Al-Qaeda. He's been at every significant Al-Qaeda incident going back Black Hawk Down. He was one of the people who taught the militiamen fighting with the Somali warlord, Mohammed Farah Aidid, how to use rocket-propelled grenades to shoot at the tail rotors of helicopters. And if you've seen the film or read the book, basically Saif al-Adil had also taught the Mujahideen how to use surface-to-air missiles, Stingers and other blowpipes and others in Afghanistan, just applied it to the situation in Mogadishu. As you can see from there, he was a pivotal player in every single major Al-Qaeda operation. Believed to be in Iran, was always out, since going back to the 1990s, Al-Qaeda's chief liaison with Iran, which should make none of us sleep very well. But I'll go to the last bullet. Interestingly, he opposed the 9/11 attacks. He predicted what would happen afterwards, that everything would come down, that Al-Qaeda would lose its sanctuary and safe haven in Afghanistan. But being the loyal Bin Laden acolyte, he saluted smartly and got on with the planning of it. But for him, attacking embassies and commercial aviation have always been what he thinks will advance Al-Qaeda's goals. And that's why I make this point that we may be re-entering an era where commercial aviation is again vulnerable. He was also the architect of the strategy, the 7-stage strategy that has guided Al-Qaeda since 2005, and also that ISIS stole for its own. And that's why he wrote this in 2005, but look at this, Stage 5 declaration of the caliphate, he predicted would occur between 2013 and 2016. And of course, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi declared the caliphate on July 1st, 2014, ISIS declared it, and then 3 days later, al-Baghdadi proclaimed it. So, to wrap up, and really to end, this is exactly what bin Laden told us in one of his last publicly released videotapes would happen. This was just before the 2004 presidential election, when he said he understands that al-Qaeda could not survive in combat against the United States military or NATO forces, and he said, and we're not going to fight them. Instead, we're going to enmesh our enemies in a protracted war of attrition, and we're going to bleed and bankrupt them. We're going to send their daughters and sons' homes in body bags. We're going to bankrupt their treasury, and we're going to undermine resolve to continue the struggle, just like we did against Russia. And bin Laden claimed credit for the chain of events that began with the Russian withdrawal from Afghanistan in December 1989, then the collapse of the Soviet Union shortly thereafter, and the demise of communism as an ideology. In 2004, this looked impossible, but inflation the way it is, the United States reeling from the economic damage done from COVID, the exhaustion and enervation from the war on terror, he may not be completely wrong. And this was his vision of definitive victory. So, really to conclude, with a very, very brief vignette, in December 1939, then Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was visiting the British troops, the British Expeditionary Force that was arrayed along the frontier between France and Belgium. The French army was, of course, arrayed along the Maginot Line. And he came up to the then unknown Lieutenant General in the British Army, Bernard Law Montgomery, and he looked out across no man's land into Belgium and said, I don't think the Germans have any intention of attacking us, do you? Montgomery, this was his commander-in-chief, very politely said, they will attack when it suits them and not before. I would say with al-Qaeda in particular, but ISIS as well, we haven't heard the last of them. And in fact, one of the few Americans who has survived being in al-Qaeda's clutches, the journalist Theo Padnos, also known as Peter Theo Curtis, wrote about his time as a prisoner of an al-Qaeda franchise in Syria between 2012 and 2014, where he said he observed al-Qaeda recruiting Westerners and preparing them for infiltration and a return back to their countries to carry out attacks against mass transit and public gathering places. So as I said, al-Qaeda has long been playing the long game. ISIS is certainly a shadow of its former self, is certainly weaker, but ISIS completely changed the nature of terrorism. They revolutionized recruitment, radicalization, and especially the use of social media. So terrorist groups were always looking to exploit our technology as weapons against us, and that would end, and especially as we enter a world of artificial intelligence, deep fakes, and so on, it's unpredictable what terrorists might do next. For both of them, the continued relevance and resonance of their ideology remains, and I displayed that earlier. Now you have an enduring ideology combined with the most visceral of all motivations, the demand for revenge and retaliation. And they feel the time is opportune because they see the United States and America's Western allies as preoccupied, distracted with other security threats, and also is weakened. So I will conclude counterintuitively with the late and great artist Prince. Our enemies are partying like it's 1999. I mean, I feel like I'm back in the 1990s with a threat. Al-Qaeda is back in Afghanistan. The Taliban is back in power. We now have multiple threats from their affiliates and from their franchises. And even though we are preoccupied with other threats, we can't neglect or forget the ongoing, continuing threat that terrorism poses. So thank you very much. And again, I'm sorry I went so long.
Going long is what they want to do.
Oh, okay, well.
So just real quick while I'm getting mic'd up. You talked a lot about al-Qaeda and al-Qaeda core versus al-Qaeda affiliates. So there's a lot of talk about that in today's age of hey, the affiliates are really taking over from al-Qaeda core. Do you see that happening, or do you see that not as a model that was being looked at?
Well, like most things in life, it's not an either or, it's both. I think that al-Qaeda, when it was under this intense pressure, and it recognized by the greatest military in the history of mankind, it understood the only way it could survive was by decentralizing, by devolving authority to its franchises and to its affiliates. And it struck this balance under bin Laden that al-Zawahiri was a big fan of. You could call it glocal or glocalism, where global concerns are grafted onto local grievances. And what they've done in a nutshell is let their local affiliates do what they want, as long as they conform to al-Qaeda's overall strategy. We know this for a fact. We know this, some of you may have read in the newspaper, again, this is some years ago, about this sort of one-eyed thug named Mukhtar Bal-Mukhtar, who just was, it's a thug and a terrorist. He was also known as the Marlboro Man because he had built his previous career before he became political and became a terrorist. He was a cigarette smuggler. And documents that were found in the 20-teens showed that even this guy who's a thug and not terribly intellectual was always paying respect to al-Zawahiri and always ensuring that all of his local violence and scams and thefts and things still made sure that he adhered to the overall strategic guidance from al-Qaeda. And al-Zawahiri used to brag that Ash-Sahab, the Clouds, which is al-Qaeda's media arm. Well, we mostly know it because it sends videos to Al Jazeera and to other places that are posted. But they also basically, it's like the AV squad, they run all communications. And al-Zawahiri used to boast that through Ash-Sahab, he was able to stay in daily contact with all of the commanders of the franchises. So, very light touch, let them do what they want, but just conform to the overall picture. So that's why I said it's a mixture of both.
Okay, and you think Saif al-Adil will be able to continue that from his perspective? He's been in Iran for a lot of years.
Yeah.
And are the young jihadists going to look at him the same way that they have the previous leaders?
That's a fantastic question, although I hate to say it's only going to be worse.
Right.
The reason I say that is that you can see this in the Abbottabad documents and a lot of bin Laden's material. These guys are racist. The Arabs, especially from the Arabian Peninsula, always looked down on the other franchises. Al-Shabaab had to wait for years before it could go into al-Qaeda's fold. They kind of always looked down on Boko Haram, which was one reason it subsequently allied itself with ISIS. Saif al-Adil spent so much time in Africa that he's fluent in most of the dialects of these groups. He could communicate them. He always had good relations. He's an Egyptian himself as well. He's not from the Arabian Peninsula. So he has very good relations with them. So if anything, I think it'll just be tighter, that they have even more respect for him. And, if he can tap into the resources of Iran, unfortunately, I hate to be drift into a conspiratorial mindset, but this really does enhance al-Qaeda's capabilities. And bear in mind, as you well know from your own work, al-Qaeda and Iran's relationship goes back to the early 1990s into Sudan. We like all these bromides, Shia and Sunni never cooperate with one another. Well, it's true up to a point, but think about it. Iran is one of Hamas and Palestine Islamic Jihad, two Sunni terrorist organizations, chief benefactors. Why not al-Qaeda as well? Especially because Saif al-Adil was the liaison since 1993, so he has great relations with them.
That's a really good pivot. So do you mind if I take that to Israel and Hamas a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so what we're seeing over in Israel right now is we're seeing a little bit more fighting really in the West Bank. But do you see a third intifada coming? Do you see Hamas rising up again as they tend to do yearly? Do you see Hezbollah, starting another war or anything like that anytime soon?
One reason Professor Natsios and Cassandra very kindly agreed to, I was supposed to speak last week and I came this week. It's because the White House asked us to do an event at Georgetown last Tuesday. And I asked this of the Deputy Homeland Security Advisor, something very similar, but in the context of why the State Department, for instance, hadn't designated as foreign terrorist organizations some of the leading right-wing groups. Now, ironically, under President Trump, which people would never have believed, in April 2021, the Russian Imperial Movement was designated as a special terrorist. It was basically a designation, not the full one. And I said, I was the moderator, I said, why have we done that to more groups? And he said, you don't understand, the problem we're facing now is less organized groups and more individuals. And that, I think, is exactly what's going to be so vexatious to the Israelis. It's not so much Hamas or Palestine Islamic Jihad or the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. It's the younger members of those groups who have tired of the senior command, whose violence hasn't delivered anything, especially after the 2021 Gaza war, and are taking matters into their own hands, or leaving those groups and cooperating amongst themselves. And that's where I think the big threat comes of more violence. But at the same time, Hamas and the established groups aren't going to stand aside and let these young guys, take over. They will become involved. And I mean, these young guys don't have missiles to lob at Israeli cities. So it's I think we're in a very, very dangerous state now, especially when Israel is so internally preoccupied and distracted by the judiciary reforms, where even Israeli reservists are refusing to come to.
Right.
I mean, from the terrorist point of view, this
It's
is
a win.
Yeah, exactly. This is when you strike, when your enemy is preoccupied and distracted. So yeah, we're entering very dangerous waters there.
Yeah. So it looks like we have one more question, if I'm reading in the back of the room correctly, and I'll take this one directly from the audience. It says, how do we go about combating the idea and beliefs of terrorist organizations here in the United States?
I think the biggest problem is we've never really tried. There's been 4 national strategies to counterterrorism, 2004, 2011, 2013, and 2018.
Yeah, because Trump came out with a national domestic terrorism strategy. He didn't come
Well,
out
Biden
with
came out with the domestic.
Biden.
But
Biden,
that's an
yeah.
important point. Again, in the world of terrorism, fortunately, a lot of times for the people charged with keeping us safe, politics doesn't enter into it. And the 2018 iteration of the national counterterrorism strategy that came out during the Trump administration was a remarkable document. Firstly, it was completely in sync with the 3 previous ones. Secondly, whereas the 3 previous ones, which I think underscores my point about how the threat's becoming more diffuse and more complex, the 3 previous ones only were focused on Al-Qaeda. The 2018 was focused on not just Al-Qaeda and ISIS, the Iranian threat network, and also remarkably focused on the threat of terrorism in the United States as well, from both the extreme right and the extreme left, as well as single issue terrorists. It was an enormously prescient document. But each one of those strategies has talked about the importance of winning the war of ideas. Going back to even President Bush said the same thing. But there's a huge problem. There's no way to quantify that. There's no metrics. When you could put up a slide like I had with, I can't remember if it's 6 or 8 senior Al-Qaeda leaders that are being killed. You know what you're spending your money on Predator or Reaper, unmanned aircraft. It's delivering results. We have no idea how we can change someone's mind or re-engineer someone's soul, and therefore, it's that none of those initiatives of countering the war of ideas has ever received the resources that it needs. I mean, think about it. During the Cold War, we had the United States Information Agency, or the United States Information Service. We had an actual agency dedicated to this, as opposed to an underfunded office in the State. If you're underfunded office in the State Department, you're just lost completely. So unfortunately, we've never prioritized it because it's not, the results aren't going to be delivered within a 4-year presidential administration or even
Absolutely
a 2-year congressional time in office. And I remember, during the war on terror, one got to do lots of interesting things. I mean, I spent 2 years as the scholar in residence at the Central Intelligence Agency. And I remember I was talking to someone who was like a really tough, hardened Marine with lots of combat experiences. And this was, this must have been the end of 2004. And he turned to me, and we were trying to solve a problem that we'd been assigned. And he said to me, we don't have enough bullets to kill all our enemies. We've got to find a different way. And he said, people denigrate this war of ideas. He said, that's all that's left. But of course, we've never really followed it and never done it seriously.
Right.
I don't think we will either. And that's what's happened. As we've weakened them, I think very successfully, kinetically, unfortunately, they have a deeper bench than we imagined. And we may have said that's the most important metric, but as General Mattis says, they get a vote too. The most important metric for them was having this ideology that may not, unfortunately, has not contaminated large numbers of people, but it's enough that they can replenish their ranks. They have the narrative that will sustain it, and that's why I think Afghanistan was such a tragedy, because we handed them that narrative, that you can wait us out, that you can defeat even the best military in the world, and that only, unfortunately, I think, inspires and motivates others to join these groups, to believe in their messages of hatred and intolerance, and anti-democratic messages. I mean, that's what terrorist groups are, totalitarians. But unfortunately, they're able to peddle a narrative that continues to have resonance, sadly, 2 decades later after 9/11.
Yeah. And that's a perfect way to end the night, I think. I will echo that I think you are the preeminent scholar
That's very kind
in
of you
this
to say.
field, and so it was an absolute joy to have you here tonight at Texas A&M. Like I said, I assign your book to my students, and I look forward to your new book coming out, and I'll have to create a domestic terrorism course to assign your new book to my
Well,
students.
thank you so
And,
much.
you know, since we just talked about the president's guidance essentially on international terrorism, and President Biden has given guidance, and it was on domestic terrorism. So it's really interesting to go out and read those things and just see how things are changing right now out there.
Well, thank you for the very kind words. If I can say one last point, I mean, this is part of the problem we face now. After 9/11, we didn't have to worry about terrorism in the United States. Right. What attention is focused on terrorism, I think also very sadly, is focused on the domestic threat, which we didn't have to contend with before. But for our enemies overseas, this is, it doesn't get better, unfortunately.
Right. Thank you once again.
You're very
Appreciate
welcome.
it.
Thank you all for coming.
Hopefully you can come back. We would love to have you back again and again. So, and thank you to the Scowcroft Center.